Okay, thank you very much, Professor Mkandawire, for agreeing to talk to us today about the politics of regional integration. The first question I have for you is, given the state of regional integration in Africa, do you think there is genuine political will for regional integration on the continent?
That's a tough question. I tried to explain in my discussion today to suggest that maybe the use of the political will is too easy a way out. Because anything that doesn't work, we can always. The evidence that there's no political will is the non-occurrence of an event, and so it's not a very good word normally. I think that there is one may call it, and I said earlier on about how Africans perceive Africa as an interesting place. There's a lot of singing about Africa, African unity, but there are no institutions that serve that sort of emotional link to the continent. And there are probably no political pressures for regional integration. And that in fact, my interest today is very much on identifying who are the actors that are for or against regional integration and what strength do they have to make their case heard or to block certain policies. And that's perhaps more important than political will as a statement.
Okay, thank you. Why do you think there is a failure within Africa in terms of the implementation of regional agreements relating to integration on the continent?
I'm a little bit confused about exactly where we are now, because in one sense, the evidence is that Africans are trading among themselves as much as we'd expect, given their low levels of development, the poor infrastructure, and so that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that there are big differences among African regional entities. So again, there's no very general story about it. But I would suggest that probably it's the failure of the national development project that then shows up, itself up in regional integration. That it'll be impossible to have successful regional integration going on when the economies are collapsing, the member states are collapsing. I think that's one of the constraints that we went through 20 years of the last decades, and countries were basically adjusting, and it was difficult to imagine them engaging in any serious regional integration scheme. I suggested earlier that if you look at Lagos Plan of Action, this was at the height of it was the tail end of an African boom. Okay? African economies had been booming, and and there were hope that they could use their resources for regional integration, and then came the structural adjustment, and I think what may be missing now is that we are not using the current boom to rethink regional integration. There is probably more room for member states now to do regional things than there were in the 80s and 90s, and so it's a good time to pose this question about regional integration.
Is a controversial one for you. In your opinion, does donor funding for integration efforts in Africa facilitate or hinder integration on the continent?
Look, money does not in itself hinder anything. It's whether the donors come up with certain policies that are related with their money. If they were just funding roads and infrastructure in Africa, and there were no conditions, there'd be no problem. Unfortunately, they tend to have their own project, and we have. Look, regional integration is a political act, and often one of the objectives is to change a region's geopolitical standing. Okay? And that means challenging other people's power. And so it wouldn't be surprising to me if other regionals felt that our regional integration was against their interest, or at least is challenging their authority of African resources. So there is an inherent conflict of interest to the extent that regional integration means reshaping Africa's position in the global world. And I think it's unfortunate Africans have not, in a way that African governments haven't really reflected about that, what it means to base your regional projects, on funding from outside. The recurring story to today's discussion was the lack of funding by member states of regional initiatives. And the budgets involved are very small. If you compare Nigeria, South Africa, the big players, they could pay for this. And why they didn't pay for it is probably because of they think there's a cheap way out, which is aid money, and some of the regional organizations find the aid money easier to manage than the money from the member states. Okay? So you may also have a bureaucratic interest that aid money is easier to you're negotiating one with the European Union, that's it. While as raising money from regionals, you have to have all these ministers to agree, and it creates an incentive for not raising money regionally. But it is a shame that African governments are not funding regional institutions, regardless of what one thinks about aid money. That it's just a shame that regional institutions should be starved of funding as they are today.
Thank you. Another difficult one, perhaps. Do you see African states willingly ceding sovereignty to supranational regional bodies? And if not, is meaningful regional integration on the continent possible?
I think today, I would say that they are much more willing than they were in the 60s. I mean, immediately after independence, of course, countries were very, very concerned with their sovereignty. Already, African governments have made huge concessions. They are now they are actually agree now to, regional institutions intervening in their affairs. We had in the 60s you could not intervene in a conflict in any part of African countries. We have seen now, ECOWAS involved in Sierra Leone, in Liberia. We've seen SADC involved, in SADC countries involved in the Congo. So there is an acceptance today, which wasn't in the 60s, that some limitations of national sovereignty for the larger purpose is permitted. And I think with democratization, the association of national sovereignty with personal glory has been reduced. And I think you will see more and more. There's definitely a strong view in Africa that no state has a right to abuse its people in the name of sovereignty. That's gone. And that was one of the most important changes in the African thinking about rights of citizens as a Pan-African preoccupation. So I can see that happening. Economically, many African countries have opened up anyway, so it's not like they were not as they were in the 60s and 70s. So the issue now is not whether you're open to the outside, is whether in fact you want to have a special relationship with the African, your neighbors, than there was in the 60s. So yes, I think today it's much easier to think of regional schemes in which nation states yield some sovereignty to this larger project.
And then finally, how does developmental regionalism differ from traditional approaches to regionalism as reflected in, for example, European integration? And do you see this as a fruitful approach for African countries?
Well, Europe, the European integration, although it has very strong sort of developmentalist projects, I mean, take the Airbus as a good example of that, was framed in the context of fairly developed welfare regimes. So there was much less talk about the European Union as a developmental project. Ours is different. The member states of African regional institutions have to catch up. That, they are back, underdeveloped, and they have to catch up. And I think the regional project, in that sense, will have to accommodate that catching up. And at national level, it's understood that the issue is not so much liberalization of markets, but also the governing of markets. And I would argue the same logic will apply regionally, that it's not simply free trade in a simple sense, but also creating, in some cases, even restraining certain, giving privilege to certain activities that you think are more dynamic, have much more dynamic linkages, and that involved much more interventionist policies. We may have a problem in Africa in that our regional institutions thinking more in terms of restraining certain practices, and they don't have resources for facilitating certain facilities. For instance, if we're talking about today about industrialization, we don't have regional banks that can fund projects that are obviously regional in terms of scale, and that may be our problem. That we have to, just as at national level, we closed down the development banks, in the 80s, and today we have no financial institutions for long-term development. And regionally, and unless we strengthen the institutions like African Development Bank and the DBS, DBSA, and make them play that bigger role of a more developmental role of funding large-scale, long-term projects. So you will have to scale up what will be developmental nationally and bring it into a regional level and make the regional project compatible with the national efforts for development. If not, politically, the regional project will collapse. Will have no support.